In this video, I'm going to go ahead and recap arrays and array lists and talk about the differences between them and the various methods and features we need to be aware of. So first of all, if we compare the differences, both of them have indices that start at 0 and go until length minus 1, or in the case of an array list, to size minus 1. With an array, we have an attribute called length, and with an array list, we have a method called size. So notice the use of the bracket or the parentheses, whereas here it's just the word length. Arrays can hold primitive values or objects, whereas an array list can only hold objects. With an array, the size is fixed, and you have to declare the size when the array is instantiated. With an array list, the size is not fixed. It can increase and decrease in size as elements are added or removed. When we're working with an array, we use the bracket notation to access entries, whereas .get method to access entries with an array list. With arrays, we can easily do two-dimensional, thinking of it almost like a matrix or a rectangular grid of rows and columns. However, with array lists, we don't really use two-dimensional array lists simply because of the way that they can change their size. We just typically don't use array lists in a two-dimensional format. And then with arrays, when we want to remove an element, we would typically make it null if it was an object, or 0 if it was an integer, false if it was a Boolean, etc. And there would be a gap in an array. In an array list, we would use the .remove method, and then everything's going to shift over. You're not going to see a null element in an array list. When we're working with an array list, there are a variety of methods that we need to be familiar with. First of all, we need to be comfortable with the constructor. Now, notice with the constructor, in the angled brackets right here, we are going to put the type of object that we are creating the array list to hold. So in that place, we could put a string or a student or bank account, etc. And then we have a variety of methods. The add method is, they're overloaded. There are two different add methods. One just adds an object, and this is going to add that object to the end. The other one is going to add it a specified index. And this is kind of like an insert method. So let's say I was adding this at index 2. Now this new object is going to go in index 2, and then whatever was at index 2 shifts down to index 3, and everything after that moves down one place. The remove index is going to remove whatever element is at index I, and then everything is going to move backwards. So let's say I said remove index 2, then whatever was at index 2 is going to be removed, and the value that was at index 3 will be shifted up to index 2. Now, it's important to remember that the remove and the set method, both of these are going to return the element that was taken out, and this is useful for us. And we'll talk about that in a few more minutes. Get allows us to access a specific value. Size tells us how big the array list is. And then this method .set allows us to change a value. So basically, add with two parameters is going to function like an insert, and then set is going to take a value that was already there and it's going to replace it with another value. So you cannot use set to add a new element to an array list to make its size bigger. You can only use set to change or replace something that was already there. Okay, so some common errors that we will see with array lists. First of all, when you're writing any kind of methods that has you remove an element, you want to use a while loop or a for loop starting at the end of the array. And the reason why this is important is because when an element is removed, the size of the array changes. And as the size changes, that for loop counter is going to keep on going on like nothing changed. However, as the size changes, as that element gets removed, whatever was after it has now shifted up, and now that value that should have been next actually gets skipped. And this is a very common trait that they will assess on the multiple choice questions. Secondly, the set and remove methods are going to return the object that was just replaced or removed. A lot of times when we use those methods, we don't do anything with these values that are returned, so we forget that it actually returns a value. However, that value is returned. And so sometimes you'll see a problem where it will say, for example, dot add, and then in parentheses, something dot remove. And so essentially what that's doing is it's removing something and then it's adding it elsewhere. And then lastly, when we're working with objects, we want to remember that we can keep on building the method calls using this dot notation. And we'll see an example of this in the next slide. So you'll see here, for example, I have this array list, and this array list has a whole bunch of strings. And I have a for loop that's going to go from the beginning to the end. And then essentially what it's doing is it's going to get the first element, so entry 0. It's going to convert it to lowercase. Then it's going to check if it starts with the letter that was passed in. So all of these things are getting stacked on. So it first goes to the array list, it gets that specific string, converts it to lowercase, then it checks if that lowercase string starts with a certain value, and then after all of that is done, it returns a Boolean, true or false, and then proceeds accordingly. So operators that we need to know with arrays. So first of all, we have to know there's a variety of ways we can declare an array. If we are just making a generic array, like we see here, in this case, what we are doing is we are setting aside, we are allocating space for 10 integers. The default integer value is 0, so this would give me a space for 10 ints, all of value 0. Now this second one is called an initializer list, and this initializer list is a list of values separated by commas inside of curly braces. And what will happen is we do not specify a size. The compiler will look at how many elements there are, and that will be how big it will make the array. Now you can only create an array with an initializer list when the array is first created. If I wanted to change the values later, I couldn't do that. If I wanted to access a value in the array, I use bracket notation. If I wanted to get the length of the array, I use .length. Remember, arrays can hold objects or primitive data. And when we're working with two-dimensional arrays, we are going to use two sets of brackets. And then first is specifying the number of rows, which is the horizontal rows going across. And then next we'll have the number of columns, which is the vertical going down. And then to access a piece of data, we just have to give the double bracket notation. And remember, everything begins with 0, 0 notation. So just a couple more things to talk about here. As we see here, looking at this, we have a two-dimensional array. And here I have an outer for loop, which gives me the rows. My inner for loop is my columns, and then this is allowing me to access each of the entries. You should be exceptionally comfortable with this double for loop notation to be able to access rows and then columns. You should also understand how to switch them if you're asked to go columns and then rows. And then notice that the array name.length gives you the number of rows. The array name bracket any row, I usually just do bracket 0, .length gives you the number of columns. Now, this second notation that we see here is the for each loop. Now, the for each loop is an abbreviated notation for arrays. And so let's go ahead and talk about that, and then we'll come back and look at the syntax. So a for each loop has lots of benefits. First of all, it's going to streamline your code, and it gives you a lot less to write. And specifically on free response questions where time is of the essence, being able to make that syntax simpler to write can be quite a time saver. Each iteration of your for each loop, there is a temporary variable that takes on the contents of the array, and it starts at index 0 and goes all the way until the end. You do not actually reference a specific index, and you will not know which specific index you are on. Now, if the array is of primitive data, like integers, for example, you cannot make any changes. And this is because the temporary variable is just that. It's a temporary primitive variable, and if you make changes to that, that temporary variable is reset every round, and it doesn't actually affect the array data. On the other hand, if the array is actually of objects, then the temporary variable is a copy of the address that that object is located at. So if we were to make changes to that address, if we were to change where it's pointing, not where it's pointing, if we were to change the object that it is pointing at, then those changes would still be made in effect. However, you cannot create objects in a for each loop. Okay, let's go back and look at the syntax. So notice the syntax, we are essentially saying, well, what am I looking at? Now, if I compare this to my original for loops, I'm going by rows. So here I'm going to say for each row, so notice that I'm saying one row, so it's a single array in this array nums, and I'm going to temporarily call this row A. And then my next one here, this inner for loop, is looking at the column entry. So now I'm going to say for each integer, so a single int value in the row, which is called A. So here I am saying I'm going to go row by row, and then within that row, I'm going to go entry by entry. And so here when I print B, B is a temporary placeholder for the specific value that I am on at that moment. And each time through that for each loop, B takes on the value of another entry. In terms of what to expect on our AP test for arrays, you will see lots of code tracing. You will see sorting and searching and traversing. You'll see regular loops and for each loops. You'll be asked if the loops are equivalent. You'll be asked to rewrite loops. You'll be asked why are the loops not working properly. You'll be asked to determine how many iterations of a loop occurs, specifically with arrays and in searching and whatnot. So it's very important that you are comfortable with the arrays. If you can write the loops well, then you can trace the code well, and that kind of goes hand in hand. All right, so for this last example here, we will talk about this one in class. All right, thank you.